Marcus Thompson gripped the steering wheel of school bus number 47 as he pulled up to Jefferson Elementary School at 7:15 a.m. sharp, his weathered face set in its usual stern expression. At 54 years old, with salt and pepper hair beneath his worn baseball cap and deep brown eyes that seemed to miss nothing, Marcus had driven this route for 8 years, without cracking more than the occasional grunt at his young passengers. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," chirped Emma Martinez, a bright 7-year-old with pigtails, as she climbed aboard. Marcus nodded curtly and waited for her to find her seat before pulling away from the curb. The children whispered among themselves about their grumpy bus driver, who never smiled and always seemed annoyed when they were too loud or moved around too much. What the children, their parents, and even the school administration didn't know was that Marcus's gruff exterior masked 22 years of experience as an elementary school counselor before personal tragedy forced him to step away from direct student interaction. His seemingly harsh demeanor wasn't irritability, it was protection, both for himself and for the vulnerable children he transported twice daily. From his driver's seat, Marcus observed everything: which children sat alone, who seemed anxious or withdrawn, whose clothing suggested financial struggles at home, and most importantly, who showed signs of being bullied or mistreated. Marcus had developed an intricate mental filing system for each child on his route. Tommy Chen, a quiet 4th grader, always sat in the 3rd row and flinched whenever larger boys walked past. Sarah Williams frequently had unexplained bruises on her arms and made excuses when other children invited her to birthday parties. Jake Morrison, usually boisterous, had become increasingly withdrawn over the past month. These observations weren't casual. They were professional assessments from someone trained to recognize signs of distress in children. Marcus used his position as bus driver to provide protection and intervention without revealing his background or creating the emotional vulnerabilities that had driven him from counseling. When Brad Stevens and his friends started targeting Tommy with verbal harassment and occasional shoving, Marcus implemented his own anti-bullying strategy. He began assigning seats, claiming it was for safety reasons, but strategically separating potential victims from aggressors. He installed a rear-view mirror system that allowed him to monitor the entire bus without turning around. "Everyone stays seated until I say otherwise," Marcus announced in his gravelly voice, establishing the authority and structure that many of these children desperately needed but weren't receiving elsewhere. On a cold November morning, Marcus noticed that Sarah Williams hadn't boarded the bus at her usual stop. Through his counselor's instincts, he recognized this absence as potentially significant rather than routine. Sarah had been showing increasing signs of stress, darker circles under her eyes, more frequent absences, and a growing tendency to withdraw from social interaction. After completing his route, Marcus drove back to Sarah's neighborhood and parked discreetly where he could observe her house. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. Through an upstairs window, he glimpsed Sarah cowering in a corner while adult figures argued violently in the background. Drawing on his professional training, Marcus knew he couldn't intervene directly without proper authority, but he also understood that waiting for traditional channels might be too late. He contacted Principal Davis at Jefferson Elementary, carefully framing his concerns as driver observations rather than clinical assessments. I've noticed Sarah Williams has been absent frequently, and when she rides the bus, she shows signs of distress, Marcus reported. As someone who's transported children for 8 years, I think this situation needs immediate attention. His measured professional language caught Principal Davis's attention in ways that a simple, grumpy bus driver complaint wouldn't have. When Child Protective Services investigated based on the school's report, they discovered severe domestic abuse in Sarah's home. The intervention likely saved her from escalating violence, but it also raised questions about how Marcus had recognized warning signs that others had missed. Principal Davis invited Marcus to her office, ostensibly to thank him for his vigilance. During their conversation, Marcus's professional vocabulary and deep understanding of child psychology became impossible to hide. "Marcus," Principal Davis said carefully, "your observations about Sarah were remarkably insightful. Have you worked with children before?" Marcus sighed, knowing his cover was blown. "I was a school counselor for 22 years before I lost my own daughter in a car accident. I couldn't handle the emotional intensity of counseling after that, but I couldn't completely leave education either. Driving bus lets me stay connected to children while maintaining necessary distance." The revelation stunned Principal Davis, who suddenly understood why their grumpy bus driver had such uncanny ability to identify at-risk children. Rather than returning to formal counseling, Marcus developed a unique role as a transportation safety specialist who used his daily routes to identify children needing support. His gruff exterior remained. It was his professional boundary. But now the school administration understood that his observations were clinical assessments from someone trained to recognize trauma and neglect. Tommy Chen's parents received resources for anxiety management after Marcus noted the boy's consistent stress responses. Jake Morrison's family got counseling referrals when Marcus identified signs of depression following his parents' divorce. Marcus never resumed traditional therapy sessions, but his daily bus routes became a form of mobile child welfare monitoring that helped dozens of vulnerable children receive the support they needed. 1 year later, Emma Martinez, now 8, asked Marcus why he never smiled. "Some jobs require serious faces," Marcus replied in his usual stern tone. "Keeping you safe isn't a laughing matter." What Emma didn't understand was that Marcus's gruffness was love, the professional love of someone who had dedicated his life to protecting children, even when that protection had to come from behind carefully constructed emotional walls. The children still called him grumpy, but they also felt safer on his bus than anywhere else, sensing the watchful care that never wavered, even when it never smiled.